Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. Today we're going to talk about some of my absolute favorite crayfish imitating baits. There's a lot of really good baits out there that do look like crayfish or crawdads or mud puppies or mud, whatever you want to call them, mud bugs. The reality is not all of them work as well as others. And I really feel like I have honed this down to a handful of baits that work really well. Just to kind of show you what I mean, like this is potentially the most realistic crayfish looking bait I've ever seen. It's a Castaic lures crayfish. The problem with it is it doesn't function really well, meaning it looks great, but there's not a lot of things that I can do with it. I can't really Texas rig it. I can put it on a jig head and it'll look good in the water, but I just don't tend to get all that many bites on it. And my reasoning for it is the fact that I feel like I don't get lifelike crayfish motions out of it. I truly believe it's the movement of the crayfish that makes the bass bite it. When you're talking about a crayfish, obviously they kind of walk around on the bottom a little bit, but that's generally when they feel like they are not in any sense of danger. When they're in danger, they flick their tail and scoot backwards. It's a very quick flick and movement. It's a burst, burst, burst. And because of that, it creates reaction strikes out of the bass. And that's where you're looking to mimic, or get your baits to mimic that movement. If you just kind of have a bait dragging on the bottom, it doesn't tend to look quite as good as a crayfish that's actually scooting away. So even though I've got a ton of these guys, because they are so lifelike looking, if I put that in my hand, it will look like a crayfish. I don't catch many fish at all on them. Do you catch some fish? Sure, I catch some fish, but I don't catch as many as I would expect. So I want to share with you some of my absolute favorite crayfish imitating baits. These are ones that are proven to work, and most of it comes down to the movement again. So before I share these with you, I do want to remind you though that I do have a members only page. So if you go to my YouTube homepage, click the join button, you can get all the information you need in terms of our membership levels. We do extra monthly videos. We do a monthly live stream. You can have direct access to me. It's a great way to support the channel, and it's a great way to get some direct contact with me if you have questions that you want to ask. Also, if you're looking to support the channel and need to purchase some tackle, please use my Tackle Warehouse affiliate link, which I'll put in the video description for you. That is also a great way to show your support for the channel when you're probably going to buy some tackle anyways. You can also bookmark that link too for future purchases. All right, so let's break this down. Like I mentioned before with crayfish, I'm generally trying to mimic that burst movement, the actual gliding movement in the water. And because of that, I'm going to say that, a lot of baits tend to not have that same movement. So for example, one of my absolute favorites is this guy right here. This is the Berkeley Max Scent Creature Hog. This bait, like a beaver, like some of your other beaver style baits, will, when sitting in the resting position, will kind of just be sitting like your crayfish. It does not have big flappers on it. It's got more of just your big arms that do a much better job, in my opinion, at mimicking the claws on a crayfish. Because when that claw scoots backwards, the two claws just kind of go side to side and get aerodynamic. Well, that's what happens here. So when this bait's resting on the bottom, if I give it a pop, it basically shoots off the bottom, creates that burst. The legs kind of tuck in place behind it, and the bait will kind of glide along and scoot along the bottom. That, to me, is extremely realistic. There are lots of times in the water where I'm looking at this on the bottom if I've got it just by my feet, and I can make it scoot around, and it looks so lifelike to me. And I think that's one of the reasons why this Creature Hog is such a phenomenal bait, as well as a lot of the other beaver style baits. It's just that motion. If you've got a bait with big flapper legs, even though they look like claws, a crayfish doesn't swim through the water with its claws flapping all over. So those claws, the big flapper claws, tend to be more important for me in dirty water. That movement actually will allow the fish to find your bait. But if you're talking about something that mimics a crayfish, you want to check out, you know, a more of your beaver profile like this max scent creature hog. That is one of my absolute favorite anytime we're talking about trying to represent my bait like a crayfish. Another one along that same line, and now this one does have some flappers, is the little Ultra Vibe Speed Craw by Zoom. This guy, it really has more to do with the profile again. So it's a very streamlined, tapered body, and then it's got legs, but the legs aren't those big flapper craws or flapper claws. They're much more streamlined. They do create a very tight vibration, but this is one of those baits that you can still get to scoot along the bottom, and it's a proven fish catcher for mimicking the crayfish. So this is one, if I am looking to impart a little bit more movement, a little bit more vibration out of my bait, that's when I'll go to something like the Speed Craw. Now, I'm sure all of you sitting at home are saying, well, you got to have a jig. You do got to have a jig. A jig is one of the best baits out there. It does a really good job at mimicking crayfish that are along the bottom. You can fish them through rock, which is one of the areas where you do find a lot of crayfish. But a couple of things to point out with it. I tend to like to go with a much more streamlined skirt, tapered and thinned out. So I'll trim my skirts down where they're not too much longer than the bottom of the hook. And then I tend to cut out a lot of that inside material to give it a little bit thinner look. If you take a big jig right out of the package, a lot of times it's real bulky. Again, I want that streamlined look of a crayfish. You know, the crayfish isn't a big flared body. So I want in the water, when I move that jig, I want it to fold into itself when it's moving, and then when it rests on the bottom to spread out a little bit. But a lot of times when it does spread out, so the bait's on the bottom, your bait spreads out, a lot of time what that does is it actually does a good job at making it look like the bottom has been disturbed, almost like a crayfish is down there rooting around and actually hitting some silt up. So I think that does a good job at drawing the fish's attention to it. It also does a good job at kind of almost in a way camouflaging the bait. You got your arms spreading out, and it gives the bait a different appearance. But I really like, again, with my jigs, I really like to have something in your chunk style bait, you know, and again, that goes back to being very similar to like this creature hog. It creates that streamlined appearance. One of my absolute favorite ways to fish a jig is to give it little hops or big hops, whether it's just a little quick wrist pop to get it to come 6, 8, 10 inches off the bottom, like it's an exploding crayfish, or if it's whether I'm stroking the jig hard, getting it to come off the bottom 4 to 6 feet. In either case, what happens is that jig condenses, hits the bottom, and then just kind of settles out. But your rod tip movements with this are going to really make the jig look like a crayfish. So those are some of the bottom baits. Now, I gotta say, you gotta have some form of crankbaits. Crankbaits are gonna be one of the best ways to mimic a crayfish that's fleeing and really just flickering along the bottom. So I generally like to have a crankbait that deflects really well and at the same time hunts really well, because a crayfish, when it is, you know, being chased and flicking through the water, it's all over the place. You know, it really kind of just depends on what position the thing is pointing when it folds its tail, and it'll take off left. Next time it takes off right. Sometimes it goes up. So it's all over the place. And that's kind of what happens with your crankbait. So if you've got a crankbait that's a really good hunting bait, you can create that erratic swimming motion of the crayfish, and that's where your crankbaits come in. So I'm generally looking for something that's got a much wider wobble. This is the Berkeley Money Badger. This is Killer Craw Color, I believe is what it's called, the Killer Craw. And it's just got the blue, you know, it's a very natural looking crayfish, blue tip, which you'd be amazed at how many crayfish actually do get some pretty good light colored blue in it. If you happen to live in some tidal waters where you got blue crab, you can get the same thing. But generally speaking, it's more about the motion. This bait gets down and really does a very good job at rooting around through the rocks and creating a lot of erratic motion. So I really like the Money Badgers anytime I'm mimicking crayfish. And along those same lines, we've got this guy right here. This is a rock crawler by Spro in one of my favorite colors. It's a, I don't recall actually the name of it. It's basically the old wigglewort phantom craw color. Wiggleworts are great baits for this as well. The only reason I'm really not saying it is because the ones I like are the discontinued, and when I talk about discontinued baits, some people get mad at me because you can't go out and get them. So a good one is the rock crawler by Spro, and again, it's a very good wide wobbling bait that does a great job at deflecting off rocks and creating erratic movement, and it does a very, very good job at mimicking the crayfish. So these are some of my absolute favorite baits to mimic crayfish. Lots of good baits out there, but these are the ones that I rely on, like I would say 85% of the time. They work pretty much around the country from north to south, all throughout the entire time of the year. Just great winners. And we know that crayfish are a great way to catch big fish. They're one of the main forage species for bass. So because of that, you know the bass are going to be keying in on it. And if you can do a good job at mimicking them, you're going to increase your odds at catching fish. So hopefully you enjoyed today's video. If you did, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Stay tuned, new video coming out tomorrow.